Aston Martin, it's a different car. Hello and welcome to Tech Talk. It's the Hungarian Grand Prix weekend and we're talking about a very green and very different car from the Aston Martin team. And that means that we're probably not going to have the time to talk about this, or why it looks a lot like that, or indeed that, or why it looks like that. And in fact, these, which are pretty interesting, and in fact, this and how it makes that work. And I guess we'll have to come back to that at some point in the future of the season. Meanwhile, everybody else is talking about this, Aston Martin's B-Spec car. Now, I don't think this really qualifies as a B-Spec car. This is a phrase that gets bandied about in motor racing quite a lot, where a team introduces a massive upgrade package to the car and call it a B-Spec. The Red Bull RB16B is a good example. It was essentially the same car with a huge amount of modifications and introduced the following season. And sometimes teams introduce B-Spec cars in season, and if you're really Williams, you get to C and D-Spec cars. But this isn't what I consider to be a B-Spec car, so why don't I consider this to be an AMR 26B? Well, the reason's simple. In my definitions, this is a completely new car. Aston Martin started the 2026 season with a car that, well, it wasn't very good, was it? They started work too late. They waited for Adrian Newey to join the Silverstone-based team after his Red Bull gardening leave was expired, which meant that he didn't turn up until April last year. And that wasn't really enough time to get started and develop a new car to the new technical regulations. So Aston Martin ended up starting out with a car that was just too heavy, it wasn't finessed, and it still needed quite a lot of work. And on top of that, Honda's new power unit wasn't performing as well as the Japanese manufacturer, or indeed Aston Martin, had expected. In fact, it was shaking the car to pieces and the drivers weren't particularly happy about driving it. Just look on board early in the season and you'll see Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll struggling with their hands on the steering wheel, so bad was the vibration through the car. It even rattled the onboard cameras to the point you could see it on screen. So Adrian Newey went back to the drawing board, learning the lessons of the early season AMR 26. Aston Martin has introduced a completely new chassis, a new monocoque, the bit the driver sits in. That had to be re-crash tested, and that's a pretty massive change. In my definitions, a new chassis equals new car, and that's why I don't consider this a B-Spec, though you can't really call it the Aston Martin AMR 27 because I suspect that's what they want to call next year's car. So I guess they're left with nothing else to call it than the AMR 26B, but from the look of it, the team aren't actually calling it that, though they probably should. Well, with all of that said about this being a new car, Adrian Newey had this to say in the press conference, which did contradict some of the earlier information that we had on this upgrade.
It's an evolution in as much as the chassis is the same, the layout's the same, front suspension's the same. So it's very much an aerodynamic evolution. We were very short on time, research time, prior to launch of the car back at Barcelona in February. So it's really been a matter of taking a step back, trying to understand and go forwards with this package.
You can see those changes quite clearly as soon as you look at it. Yes, it's green, and yes, it's still got a very similar Sidepod concept, but really the only things that I can see that have carried over from the early season car are the gearbox, the rear suspension layout and the general car concept, but there's still so much more to see. So let's see it. Well, I mentioned that the chassis needed a new crash test. I don't know this for a fact, but I suspect that the nose of the car also needed a new crash test as well. Have a look at this is the new specification nose, and have a look at its shape. It's much thinner, much smoother than the early season AMR 26 was. Now here's the old nose, much chunkier, much wider nose, and the front impact structure is inside this nose. It's sort of a triangular sort of structure like that. It's a bit more complicated than that sits on the inside. Now, I don't think the original front impact structure will have carried over to this new, much thinner nose structure. You can really see the difference. Of course, the front wing shape is completely new as well, following pretty much the same concept. The nose still picks up on the middle element of the front wings as it did on the old version, but as you can see, the wing has been slightly reshaped and the actuator still sits underneath the centre of the nose for the active aerodynamics. But really, it's a very different concept. And when you're changing your nose of that car to a much thinner nose, and of course we all know that Adrian Newey likes a thin nose on his cars, going back all the way to the early Red Bulls, you can probably imagine that everything downstream of it has changed as well. And you'd be right, but let's start on the front wing because the end plates have changed quite considerably. But before we get into the end plate shape, I just want to show you, just from this angle, you can see the nose shape here. And it's quite a clear shape, not very well illustrated there by me. But when you compare that version of the nose, which is on the car today, to the original specification, look how bulbous the leading section of the nose was in Bahrain. Much deeper section, much wider. It's a chunky old thing, isn't it? Don't get confused by that black stripe on the floor. You can see the nose shape really well. I took that photo earlier in the year. And then here you can see the bulbous section is largely gone. There's still a bit of a contour there, but it reminds me a little bit more of the 2008 Honda style nose, which McLaren have got. And it's just a much thinner nose package overall. And that means the ducting through the nose for the driver cooling package has had to change, the actuator mounting has to change, and every other element around it has to change. And you can still see the front suspension still follows the same rough pickup points, but I've seen some photos online that make it pretty clear that the car's got new front uprights. That's the metal structure that holds the whole thing together at the wheel end, where the brakes are mounted, where all of these suspension arms meet, and where the steering rack meets. Well, if you change the front uprights, that's a massive structural change to the car, and that will change your whole front suspension layout, how it mounts, the angles, the aerodynamic performance. But of course, that's all behind this new front wing, this new nose. All of that concept has changed. So that alone is a massive change for the Aston Martin team. Now let's move on to the end plates. Now the front wing end plates on this generation of car are a huge area of experimentation, but one little detail that Aston Martin have got is they've integrated their front tyre sensor into the upper outer element of the front suspension. And you can see the shape of the end plate and the foot plate here. It's very curvaceous, but follows largely some of the trends we've seen up and down the grid. But it is still quite different to what we've seen earlier in the season. This is the early season version of the Aston Martin front wing end plate, and you can see the leading edge is slightly different. You've got these vertical elements that curve around, I'm not sure what you'd call them, we'll come back to that, and you can see the shape of it is somewhat different, but it does still follow the same concept. You don't have a remote sensor here as well, that's still integrated into that upper section, as you can see on the front wing end plate here. Now let's take a look at the front wing end plate from another angle so we can do a direct comparison, because I like doing that. So here's the new specification front wing end plate, and you can see it's a much wider curved section on the outboard section. You can see that kind of downwashing upper element, and then just the overall shape of that end plate section and that flat rear of it. Now let me clear my scribbles off it, and then let's take a look in a direct comparison to the early season version. And you can see it is quite different, but there is limited scope in the regulations to what you can do with these end plates. You can mount the tyre sensor differently, and you can mount vertical elements on the foot plate. So there is exploitation and experimentation for Aston Martin to come there, but what they've got is what they've got, and it is still quite an experimental time for this new car. And I do say new car, meaning new car. Now there has been a huge amount of talk online about the sidepod design of this revised or new Aston Martin. And yes, the team has completely revised the sidepod inlet, almost going back to the old Red Bull style from about 2021 Hungarian Grand Prix spec car, where it looked like the whole back of that Red Bull had melted and the sidepod ducts were getting ever smaller, and Aston Martin were repeatedly copying what Red Bull were doing. Not so much with this one. Nobody else is going for this style of inlet at the moment, but it is a new and revised version on the car. But I don't think we should be spending too much time looking at that bit in isolation, because everything else is new. I mean, the roll hoop, I guess, is about the same as the old car, but again, lightened, and so they've had to do the tests again. So that's a big factor here. But what I want to draw your attention to in this shot is the bargeboard area of the car. Now you can see the design of it, and it's pretty much of a muchness for what you've seen up and down the grid all season long. But take a look from a different angle. This is the new version on the car. And I want to draw your attention just to the vertical height of it here behind the front wheel on the upper element, but also to the top surface of the leading edge of the floor, because this was an area that Aston Martin started to exploit that no other team had. If you remember, they had a big sculpting down here with a couple of little sticky uppy bits to manage the flow in the wake of that front wheel. Actually, there's no point in me drawing it when I can just show you. It looked like that. And this is what they had earlier in the season. But look at the height of the leading edge or the reading element of this part, it goes all the way out of my screen, and that's nothing to do with camera lenses or elements or how we've cropped the image. It is significantly larger and taller. And then you've got those two elements there and there, which you can see with that sculpting on the leading edge of the floor. Well, that's all gone from the upgraded car, the new car. And that's a bit of a surprise, because this was an area that Aston Martin clearly spent a lot of time and energy on and have seemingly abandoned. So pretty much a big concept change to that part of the car for Aston Martin. Are they going to go back to it? Well, we'll have to wait and see how this quite different car develops. The other thing to look at here are the pickup points on the front suspension, how low they sit on the base of the monocoque here. That's something else the team will be looking at very closely. I don't think those pickup points have changed dramatically with this new chassis, but they had the opportunity to do it. So I do wonder if there's been some slight movement on that. As we know, the uprights have changed, so why wouldn't you change the inboard pickup points when you've got the opportunity? In this shot I've just called up onto the screen, you can see the overall shape of the sidepod, and I think it's pretty spectacular actually. Aston Martin have got a very thin, very raised sidepod concept. Almost takes you back to the early season version of the AMR22 with those very high sidepods, which they abandoned after the Green Bull scandal. Well, because of the Green Bull scandal. Either way, the Green Bull got rid of those high sidepod concepts, and here Aston Martin seems to have drifted back into that area with these high remote sidepods. No other team has got a concept exactly like this. In this picture I took in Bahrain, you can see the shape of the sidepod from the top, and you can see these huge undercuts on the base of it. You can really see how much that sidepod sticks out above the floor and exposes more of the top edge of the floor surface, which is something the team wanted to do for aerodynamic effect. Then you can start to see the mirror housings. Actually, that's something that's pretty carried over from the old spec to the new, but has been revised. This is something here that has been completely deleted. The big tall sticky uppy bit has gone. That's a shame. And another area to look at is the cooling outlets here. And you can actually just see inside the cooling outlets, because they were absolutely huge on the original specification of car. You could see right into, and you can in this image, see right into the top of that Honda V6 power unit. Well, that's something that hasn't changed for the Hungarian Grand Prix. Honda's new power unit isn't ready for this weekend, but it will be officially introduced in Zandvoort. So we won't get to see the full potential of this package quite yet, but we will get to see on a quite twisty circuit what the chassis has got. And chassis loads, the Hungarian Grand Prix, can be hard to predict. And that was certainly true with the rear suspension, but we'll come back to that in a moment. Looking at the cooling package on the new car, let's do a comparison and de-telestrated for me. That's quite nice. And you can see the cooling layout has changed quite considerably. While they follow the same concept, the cooling louver is a very different shape. And then you can also see the top of the sidepod has been revised in its shape as well, but you've still got that huge undercut. Here we've got an additional blanked off cooling section, which is new on this variation of car. But if you remember that vertical element here, well, as you say, that's completely deleted. You're not going to see that anymore. But as we move rearwards along the car, you can start to see some subtle differences. What's drawn my attention is this little hump on the engine cover, not particularly clear to see in this shot. So looking from another angle at the back of the car, you can see though that bump a little bit more clearly here. Now that gives away a little bit of a secret as to what's going on. Before I get into that, just note this centerline cooling outlet you've got here. That's a new feature for the car, and you can really see how the cooling louvers on the bodywork here are reshaped. Don't get confused that this is a cooling outlet. It's not, it's just a seatbelt. So you can really start to understand what's going on here. The bodywork package at the rear has just got a whole lot tighter. It's like they've shrink wrapped around that power unit. Of course, the power unit's cooling demands, which we know are quite high, haven't changed, and we're at one of the toughest circuits on the calendar for cooling, and we're using that old power unit. So I think this is very much a test session for Aston Martin. But at this angle, you can start to see some of the other elements of the car which are worth taking a look at. Looking on the inner face of the front wheel, you can just see a small extension to the aerodynamic element around here. And well, let's get a better look at it in a different shot, because we can see that much more clearly when we get closer up, and you can see the sculpting to this lower element. Now this is a completely revised part for this very upgraded car, and you can see how much of an aerodynamic effect all of those suspension arms will have on everything downstream from this angle. and that's why these have all been revised. Of course, the brake ducting is also brand new on the car as well. So huge amounts of development there, but as we start to look at the old specification bodywork, it almost looks outdated, doesn't it? As Aston Martin have moved forward with the development package on the car. Now we move around to another element of the rear of the car. You can see those blisters on the bodywork there where it's packaged quite tightly. I don't know what around, maybe the top of the turbocharger housing perhaps of that Honda power unit. But what I did want to draw everybody's attention to is the rear suspension, because one of the few parts of this new Aston Martin that has carried over from the early season version is the transmission, the gearbox, which means the rear suspension mounting points are pretty similar. And one of the distinctive factors of the original season Aston Martin was the inboard upper pickup points of the rear leg of the wishbone, which actually mounted so high up that they were on the rear wing pylon supports, which is a really interesting area to mount it. But also you've got to think it's right next to the exhaust tailpipe, which gets very hot. And these composite structures, well, they're going to start having different properties as they get hot. So is this suspension geometry going to start to change as the car drives? And we know the car had some handling problems. So I started to wonder, well, is this a stiff enough part? Well, suggestion is when we look at the new car, no, it wasn't strong enough, because they've introduced a bracing element between the upper section of these two wishbone mounting points, which suggests that actually, yes, they felt there was a need to strengthen that part of the car. But strengthening the rear suspension is perhaps something Aston Martin needed to spend a little bit more time on, or it could have been a production issue. Either way, Lance Stroll's rear suspension didn't last free practice 1 in Hungary. Just have a look at this.
3-2.
Oh no, it's already gone. Just loads of drive going on the rear axle, up through a couple of gears, and crunch, something's gone.
But that's not the only area of interest in the rear of the car. As we come around right to the back of the car, I just wanted to show you the outer edge of the diffuser. You've got these additional elements on top of the diffuser cascade here, and I'm loving how complicated and complex these diffuser edges are getting on this generation of car. It's something that we haven't seen for a very long time in Formula One, and it's getting quite exciting to see how much technical development there is in this area of the car. In fact, just have a look at that, but also have a look at how the rear suspension shapes are interacting with the diffuser. Look at that curvature on that rear suspension element. That is something quite remarkable to see. And here's a shot of the diffuser, because teams don't like us looking at them, so there's one. Moving on, because you know I like showing you stuff like that here. The last thing I want to show you, because there is so much to see on this car, is the rear wing, because where else would you look? And here is the rear wing, and what I want to show you is actually the active aerodynamics actuator, because that in itself is quite different to what we've seen before. But before I get to that, look at these angles on the upper wishbone rear mounting points. These are absolutely ridiculous in shape. That is some pretty extreme engineering going on right down there. But when you look at the active aerodynamics actuator pod, it's got this additional section right across the top. I had thought at one point that Aston Martin had developed its own version of those rotating wings that quite a few teams are using. McLaren introduced one in Hungary, of course, as well. Or they ran it in Austria. Well, they didn't run it in Austria. They turned up with it and then thought about it and took it home again. But they've also introduced these extra elements on the outer edges of the rear wing and one in the centre line. That's very much following the Mercedes lead of taking advantage of that extra area of freedom along the rear wing. But this is the early version of the car, and you can see how much more basic it is. While the new actuator does follow the same mechanical package as the old, these additional parts on the top, well, we'll have to study how they function in a little bit more detail. So we're still learning a lot about this new Aston Martin, but also so are the team, and the hopes there are not, well, they're very measured, because there's an awful lot still to learn. And when you introduce a new car, which is essentially what Aston Martin are doing, you need to do a lot of development on how to set it up, how to use it, how to operate that car. And that's really what Aston Martin are going through at the Hungaroring. And that makes me think that really this weekend is an extended test session for them. And we won't really get to see what this package has got until we get to Zandvoort or even Monza, when for the first time we get to see it in low downforce configuration. And that will be pretty interesting with this new set of regulations. But for now, Aston Martin, fascinating new machine. Will it turn things around? Well, talk of improving lap time by 1 to 2 seconds mean that will just jump in front of Cadillac, which isn't that much, but it is a step in the right direction.